and particularly over the last few years, to raise Sibelius's profile in France. I wonder if you could give me a brief potted history of the reception of his music over there.
In France, there was a very famous musicologist, composer, conductor, René Lebowitz. René Lebowitz was a sort of a similar character to the German musicologist who's Adorno. Both of them thought that Sibelius was the worst composer ever. And in fact, there is a very famous sentence by Lebowitz that Sibelius is the worst composer ever. As a result, of course, all the young music lovers, musicologists, music educators, professors, musicians, all musicians, were trained in these Central European countries that Sibelius is really not worth anything. The reason this idea came to play is because these two men thought that the direction in which the new music has to go, if it's any good, is a sort of, something that ended up being the second Viennese school, the serial music after. And they simply disagreed with the direction in which Sibelius went, and he was considered first of all not very good in terms of the form, but also very old-fashioned in terms of the direction. They dismissed similarly Rachmaninoff and anybody else who dared to write music that had a certain romantic feel to it. As a result, Germany and France, and especially France, had very little exposure to Sibelius' music. They all know and love the violin concerto because the soloists insist on playing that, and great soloists. But it so happened that in all the years of Orchestre de Paris and all the musical years of other orchestras, there has never been a complete set of Sibelius symphonies that has been recorded by a French orchestra. And this is now 21st century, and we still don't have a complete set. So when I was a music director there, I thought that this has to be changed, and this is something that I would like very much to remedy. And we started playing Sibelius, and one of the things that I noticed is that the orchestra, this is an exceptionally good orchestra, how well they played this music. And I realized that they have no tradition of this music, which meant that they are reacting and following their instincts and reacting to the actual music that comes out of their instruments and something that they are hearing. And even the most enigmatic symphonies, let's say, like, for example, number 4, which I think is a genius of a piece, they didn't dismiss it as something that's difficult to understand, but somehow they were open to explore it, and they had no preconceived idea that this is difficult, or this is unusual, or this is hard to listen to, or somehow less obvious than others. They just saw Sibelius 4, that's it, let's just play. And what I loved about this whole experience is how open-minded the orchestra was, and how much they brought this real old world warmth, the sound that had enough room and space to breathe, something that Orchestre de Paris is well known for, the kind of sensuous and warm sound. And to me, when I heard that, I thought, this is exactly where we need to record these symphonies, because otherwise I would need to spend most of the time undoing and convincing musicians not to follow the so-called tradition. There is nothing wrong with tradition, but sometimes the tradition is just a series of bad habits, a series of gestures that are not any more believable. So the tradition while it's important to know the tradition, can sometimes become a handicap. It can become something that people follow without actually thinking why. And if very often you hear very famous pieces played in a certain way over and over and over, and not because it's written by a composer, but because they've heard a recording where somebody did a rallentando, and so everybody else now manufactures and does the same thing without thinking why. So it is a luxury to have been able to record these pieces and explore this music with an orchestra that does not have a preconceived notions about this music and really follows their heart when they play it.
And did you consciously wait until a point in your career where you would have that opportunity to start with a tabula rasa, if you like, rather than recording with an orchestra that had perhaps done this cycle 3 or 4 times on disc?
One of the things that I regret is for recording a lot of standard repertoire when I was young, because you want to do your Tchaikovsky or you want to do your Mahler or Beethoven, but advice to a young conductor: stay away from standard repertoire when you're young. There's plenty of good music and interesting music that you should be championing as a young musician. With Sibelius symphonies, and for a Nordic conductor, I'm Estonian. Of course, a Beethoven set is the kind of a defining set, because that has to be something that is good. And for us, it's a Sibelius. For a Nordic conductor, a Sibelius set is something that means something very special. Every Nordic conductor has recorded the Sibelius set. Some of them, like Paavo Jarvi, has recorded it twice. In fact, even 3 times. And this is no joking matter. So for me to do this now was a very conscious decision, because I didn't want it to do it too early, and I wanted to be special. And I found an orchestra that I knew would be right for it. And it also would be very unlikely orchestra. That I liked the fact that it was not an expected collaboration, something that would have kind of marketing-wise made sense, like Estonian orchestra or a Finnish orchestra or a London orchestra, for that matter. That he's London and England is they're great Sibelius lovers and play Sibelius very well and have a long tradition of Sibelius. But coming from Paris, that's really unusual and slightly suspect. And I kind of liked that idea. I liked that we present something a little bit different, a little bit fresh, and bit controversial. That's always and by doing that, I think that we will convince a lot of French musicians and a lot of French audience to have a very serious second look at a composer called Sibelius.
Was there anything in particular, either throughout the cycle or in specific symphonies, that you wanted to undo? You talked about this inherited tradition. Were there any particular traditions that you felt yourself reacting consciously against?
When I grew up in a conductor's family, and Sibelius was played in our house all the time. Recordings of Sibelius, and of course Bernstein was the big influence and one of the great Sibelius conductors, really. And then of course famous Karajan recordings, but of course all the recordings from already Robert Kajanos to Paavo Berglund to Barbirollis to Beecham's to Stokowski's. I mean, we had everybody who has ever recorded it, we had it. And what I felt, and I grew up with this really old world recordings, super slow, romantic, very kind of almost late romantic kind of Richard Straussian type of interpretations, which were totally beautiful and convincing, yet as I grew older, I thought that maybe Sibelius need to have a little bit more straightforward approach, a little bit something that has more impulse, a little bit more rhythmical vitality, not so not so much influenced by Wagner and Brahms and Tchaikovsky. And so in the beginning, when I was starting to conduct the symphonies, it was a little bit sort of exaggeration to the other side, where everything was fast, quite kinetic, quite hard-hitting, quite modern, if you will. And now, after literally conducting this music for 25 years, I think the truth is somewhere in between, where you need to find the rhythmic clarity, the impulse and the heartbeat that is clearly there, and still have room to breathe and have to really connect with that time. It was still an old world, a world where the sound world that was expected and understood and was in the ear of composers like Sibelius was still an old world Germanic, lush sound, full of color, full of sostenuto, and nuanced but rich sound. Something that I find very difficult now to find in any orchestra, in fact. Of course, there are great German orchestras like Berlin that can do it, but I find Orchestre de Paris can do that. They have the string sound that's still, even in French music, that is full of rich color and nuance and juice. Something that I find that this music, Sibelius, really needs. And so I sort of went from loving the romantic performances to exact opposite, to really insisting that it has nothing to do with the Russian tradition, and now sort of understanding that it probably somewhere in between is the right compromise.
One final question. Your father recorded the symphony, I think, with Gothenburg, am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah. How much discussion do you have about issues like this within your very musical family?
A lot of discussion.
Yeah.
A lot of discussion, constant discussion about music. We talk very often, mostly on either FaceTime or Skype, but it's basically, when we talk about music, we talk about interpretations, we talk about the musical world. But of course, if you have a luxury of having such a master on the phone, then how can you not ask and discuss the important points? And interestingly, because he has recorded it and played all his life Sibelius, the wealth of information and also what's important, not so much direct information as more the kind of relaying the experience of what he had, and one can learn so much from just hearing the type of practical things also that he suggests sometimes. So we have a lot of discussions, and I still learn a lot from that.
Thank you so much.
My
Thanks.
pleasure.